This is George Davison, bringing you the history of the Faculty Association of the College of New Caledonia since 1969, from the unceded territory of the Tla'autla people. So Prince George has been around since 1915, though the Cal people have lived here since time immemorial, using the region at the junction of the Fraser and Nechako rivers for millennia. But the fur trade came in here, Simon Fraser and Company, in the early 1800s, and set up a post here in the 1820s. But it was 100 years before the railway came across Canada and through Prince George, and there was a huge rush for real estate. The town itself was really got off the ground in 1908, 1909. South Fort George, steamboats plied the Fraser River and took supplies up the Upper Fraser. The town itself was incorporated in 1915, but had very slow growth. One, because World War I hit, and then the Depression of the 20s and 30s. World War II gave it a boost, particularly because of the lumber in the area. There were like 600 mills between Prince George and the Robson Valley, and it took off after World War II. So you can see from the slides that the small town became much bigger in the 50s and 60s. Population went from under 14,000 to 33,000 in 1971. And so the demand for post-secondary education grew. The Macdonald Commission, Macdonald was a former president of UBC, he was commissioned to do a study of what the post-war baby boomers were going to require in terms of post-secondary education. And he recommended that regional colleges be set up, but also regional vocational schools. And so Prince George was established as one of those. The vocational school opened in 1964 on the current grounds of the college, but a small start to begin with. And then the community college itself was put forward by the school districts. There was a referendum in June of 1967. 5 of those districts, people in the district said, yes, thumbs up, let's go. Quesnel didn't, although they later came on board. But on the basis of that support, an interim college council was established in late 1967, and they hired Wolfgang Franke as the first principal. He started in August of 1968. Franke had been a German officer during World War II, but ended up in a Yugoslavian concentration camp at the end of the war. Came to Canada in the 1950s, went to university, was a high school teacher, a biology teacher, and then principal. And on the basis of his experience there, he got the job as the founding principal of Lambton College in Sarnia. So he set about hiring faculty. Apparently one of his tests was offering the prospective employee a cigarette, and if they took it and started smoking, they were off the list. If they didn't, that was one test that they passed. But the 4 program areas that the council had said they wanted to get going were first-year university arts and sciences, admin science, data processing, and early childhood education. The tuition was about half of what UBC's was at the time. 25 faculty were hired, and classes started in September of 1969 in the after-hours classrooms of Prince George Secondary School, which actually just opened across the way from where the college is now the year before. 248 students started. And the official opening at Vanier was on October the 10th. Best of luck, said the Minister of Education, as they as a military band, played in Vanier Hall. The first year was a pretty raucous one, and of course the paper in town made note of who was hired and things that were going on. Ted Faulkner was a geologist who was hired fairly early on. Franke wanted quite a range of programs represented, and he hired an English instructor from UBC who had been a student there, Charles Boylan. And the newspaper headline in the Prince George Citizen was "Ex-commie hired for college." Charles had a noted background as a communist, though he'd actually left the party over the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. But he was a lifelong Marxist-Leninist, ran for the party many times in Vancouver, and I ended up meeting him at a BC Fed convention many years later, trying to find out what had happened when he was let go the first year. He was not renewed. But anyway, the Faculty Association got off the ground pretty quickly. On August the 11th, they had a meeting, chose interim officers. Faulkner was president. Boylan was on the executive. They then set about tasks for themselves, who was going to work on the Constitution. They had workload scheduling and library committees, and off they went. Boylan was the one who did the newsletter for the first year. His wife was also involved in the student newspaper called Kuhn. And they were involved in anti-Vietnam activities. They were involved in demonstrations supporting First Nations in the area. Things were pretty controversial in the late 60s and early 70s, and they were right in the thick of it. You can see from this slide that revenues were $202 for the first year. The fees were $1 per $1,000 of salary. They didn't have much of a surplus. And the salary schedule was one that was proposed. It wasn't the one that they ended up with. I think that they initially agreed on $8,200 as a starting salary, and salary scale topped out at about $12,000. Early on, too, the Faculty Association was approached by representatives from Capilano College. And here's the letter here. James Turrell sent Ted Faulkner a letter inviting him to a meeting on the Remembrance Day long weekend in Vancouver to look at a provincial federation. So there was to and fro about all of this. A constitution was developed, and that was sent to all of the locals. FACNC voted to join on March the 13th, and Faulkner was the delegate to the first AGM that occurred in Vancouver at what's now Langara on the Easter weekend in 1970. Faulkner, interestingly, fought with the first executive of the CFF because he wasn't reimbursed for his expenses quickly enough. The local ended up covering his costs, but at one point he threatened to take them to court over it. And of course, a new organization just getting going didn't have any dues yet, so he wasn't very patient and stepped down as president after his first year. The second president of FACNC was a fellow by the name of Al Leverage. He was one who was in charge of the new IBM computer at the college, teaching data processing. And he had been at Lambton College, so he was handpicked by Franke to come to CNC, and he was the second president, although he only lasted about 6 months. Gordon Ingalls, who was a philosophy prof, hired by Franke just before he too was let go by the college council. He became the interim president and then was elected president the next year. He was also at the second AGM at Selkirk, and was elected vice president of the CFF. So the issue of what was going to happen with the vocational schools in these new community colleges, people said, well, put them together. They could use the classrooms, property, all that kind of stuff that the government had set aside for these institutions. And the whole process was called the MELD. So it started late in the SOCRED years, went through the NDP years, and wasn't finalized until the kind of second coming of the SOCREDs after 1975. And there were lots of issues to sort out. The NDP gave public servants the right to unionize, so the members of the vocational school were BCGEU members, and the Faculty Association, of course, had its own association, though it wasn't yet unionized. And it went through the process of trying to bring these vocational faculty on board. I think there were 17 of them. And so that it was at the local level. One of the welding instructors at the college, or at the vocational school, and Gordon Ingalls knew each other. Bob Martin was the president of the Society for Vocational Instructors, and Gordon brought him to a Nanaimo executive meeting of the CFF to talk about how this process was going to go and then make representations of the government to smooth the path. Anyway, it took quite a while, and there were delays and delays and delays, but ultimately the vocational instructors came into the Faculty Association. And interestingly, vocational instructors at BCIT, at Camosun, at Okanagan, at Northwest, they stayed separate. And so they are still members of the BCGEU, whereas the faculty who teach university studies, for the most part, are members of the Faculty Association. This is a quick look at bargaining in the first decade. There's the first 10-step scale in 1970. Interestingly, a case at SFU over academic freedom threw into doubt the agreements that faculty associations had with their employers at the universities and at the colleges. And the CFF took this on and asked for a legal opinion in 1972, I believe. Stuart Rush was the lawyer. And he said that the handbooks that faculty associations were working on really didn't have much legal force, except for the one at the College of New Caledonia. And that's basically because of the way the Faculty Association handled it. They delegated a committee to negotiate with the College Council. Both sides ratified it, and so the collective agreement, or handbook it was called at the time, had validity. When the Faculty Association unionized, it was much easier to do that, but this happened early on. So you'll see pay increases occurred over the 1970s, but what also happened was increasing centralization, especially after the NDP lost power in 1975 and Bill Bennett's SOCREDs came back into power. They passed the College and Institute Act in 1977, which basically took away the school district authority over offerings at the college. And so board members started to be appointed provincially. That ramped up in the early 80s, and the funding increasingly came from the province. Initial funding for a lot of the programs came from the school districts, which was why there was some resistance to start with. So FACNC became a trade union under the Labor Code in March of 1976. There's the certification, primarily engaged in the teaching function. They tried to get part-timers in, and locals like Capilano were able to get them in initially, but that had been, I think, under the NDP. When the SOCREDs came in, it became tougher to get folks certified, and the Labor Board refused to do that with part-timers at CNC. So it took an arbitration in the early 80s. Robert Byrd was the arbitrator to actually say that there was a community of interest and that the part-timers were doing the same stuff that full-timers were. They just weren't paid properly, or their working conditions were not handled under the collective agreement. So he said they should be. The Faculty Association, after this award, came back to the college and said, well, they're in now. And the college said, no, they're not. And so it took 2 years of negotiations to get them in. And in the middle of that, there was a strike by the support staff that lasted 6 weeks. Here's some pictures of CNC in the mid-70s. Portables were the mainstay of the college for close to 2 decades. Obviously, the arrangement with the PGSS didn't work out all that well as the number of students grew. And so these portables were brought in the mid-70s. And they were in use until I came, it was mid-90s before they were finally removed, and a new addition on the front, I got rid of them. And the buildings were named after regional campuses. So the portables I were in were called Smithers, A, B, C, D, and E. I was in Smithers E. It had the ESL program. There were 2 classes of 16 each ESL in the 80s and 90s. And extra people, when they started hiring more in the early 1990s, ended up in the Smithers buildings. There wasn't enough room on the main campus. But the main building of the campus was finished in the late 70s, and it would wait until the 90s for more additions. In the meantime, offerings started building at regional campuses. The first one was in Vanderhoof, the Nechako campus, built in the old hospital, 1975. Lakes District was in portable, I think, to begin with, though it took over a school, renovated that, and so this is what it looked like, what it looks like today, but it's been that way probably since the mid-90s. Mackenzie's classes were in the Evergreen Mall. It's now called the Evergreen Center. And Quesnel, the largest regional campus, started in 1980 and operated out of an accountant building on McLean Street. In the early 2000s, the college got approval to build a new campus, joint campus with UNBC on the south side of town, and so it opened in January of 2006. There have been smaller programs offered and shorter duration programs offered in Valemount in the Robson Valley. And here's a sign for outdoor rec that didn't last all that long. But another campus was built in Fort St. James in 2007. And there are still programs being run out of there. It was an old sporting goods store that was renovated. So here's Premier Bennett opening the Vanderhoof building in 1979, and a picture of what the college looked like when I came in the early 90s. So here's a slide about bargaining in the 1980s. Paul Ramsey and Jan Seo, who have been important in the push towards a provincial model of CIA from the CFF in the 1970s. Both of them came back to Prince George. Ramsey was an administrator for a while, but president of the Faculty Association in the mid-70s and again in the mid-80s before moving on and up to CIA. Jan Seo was the second president of CIA in the early 80s. But these were tough years bargaining with the college and the restraint of the social credit government, even though inflation was pretty high and pay increases looked big. This is a slide about strikes and strike votes. I mentioned the strike in 1984. There had been a really short one in February and March of 1981 by the support staff at the time. And faculty and support staff were involved in Operation Solidarity in the 3-day sympathy strikes that occurred in the latter part of the fight against the Bennett government for the restraint that they brought in July of 1983. FACNC itself went on strike in February of 1995. I was the local president at the time, and took a strike vote in 1998 to support the Common Table, but only had the one strike. There were lots of grievances and arbitrations in the 80s. This is some clippings from newspapers at the time. This was a slide showing ads that the Faculty Association put in the local paper when the college refused to take their stalemate to arbitration. So they said, okay, you're not going to do that. Let's settle here locally. And there were layoffs almost every year, sometimes quite large, and the whole process was getting sorted at the time. Charles McCaffrey was a president who came in 1978, had a non-confidence motion in him the year after he arrived, and the Faculty Association and the principal were at war through most of the 80s. And because the principal didn't like the faculty all that much, and because there was a lot of restraint in terms of funding from the provincial government, he tried to find all sorts of ways to take programming out of the college and run it in the community. One of these was called the CART program, Center for Advanced Resort Technology. The college, well, it wasn't the college, it was the college principal that had a board and this organization that was basically doing computer-assisted design and manufacturing as it was coming into the market. I got millions of dollars for this, but frittered it away. And it was duplicating what other organizations were already doing in the city. The track program was set up as self-paced computer learning. It was another way of getting rid of faculty. And the Enterprise Development Center was a way of taking business and general interest courses and offering them downtown. Contracting out was an issue that cropped up 10 years after it started and was the spark for the strike in 1995. FACNC has hosted two SIA AGMs, one in 1990 and the other in 2003. This one occurred just before I arrived. Bruce Strachan, a Socrat, was the Minister of Advanced Education at the time. He and McCaffrey and Tom Stedman, who ran the Canadian Tire, and some prominent lawyers in town were the ones who were pushing for a University of the North. So the Socrats legislated it in the late 80s, at about the same time that they brought into existence university colleges. And CNC was supposed to be one of those university colleges, but McCaffrey didn't want that. So there's an interesting story by Gary Boslaw, who was a faculty member here in the early 70s, went on to Malaspina in Nanaimo after that, and he was the vice president academic in the late 80s. I don't think the island was scheduled to get a university college until he heard on the radio one morning that a couple of them had been named, Okanagan and Kamloops, Caribou and Okanagan University College. And so he said, well, how come we weren't one? And so he went to his principal at the time. The principal went to the minister at the time, and that's how Malaspina became a university college, benefiting from CNC dropping dropping the ball. Increased push to get better working conditions and pay for part-timers in the 90s, but also increased coordination amongst the CA locals. So there was a coordinated bargaining council, the CBC, in the early 90s. Langara went on strike. Douglas was on strike in the late 80s. VCC was on strike in 1990. And so locals were trying to line up their bargaining date, their end of agreement dates to March the 31st. And by 1998, just about all of the locals had done so. UNBC was delayed a year. It took a long time to build it, and the $20 million road going up to it kept sliding. But the Queen arrived in 1994 and opened it up on her way to opening up the Commonwealth Games that year. The two institutions had designated 4 program areas to work together. Nursing, which led to a lot of layoffs here, forestry, business and social services. And the rest of us were left to work out with our university counterparts, avoiding duplication of courses and offering more choice for students in northern BC. CNC celebrated its 25th anniversary in 1994, so there's a lot of hoopla there. The Faculty Association and the college had started negotiations, found out in the middle of it that the college was trying to run psych courses off-cycle, charge twice as much, and hire non-union faculty. And so we took a slow march towards ramping up pressure on the college with a vote to take a strike vote and a strike vote. And then we brought a mediator in, Steve Rinfret, and he was not able to bring things together. The college president had actually come over to the Faculty Association office. I said my committee was ready to bargain any time, and we did hammer out contracting out language that didn't stop it from happening, but provided a process to deal with it. And if something was contracted out 1 year, then it would be brought into the bargaining unit if it was offered repeatedly. But he couldn't bring his own side on board. So we had a 3.5-week strike in the middle of winter, and here are some pictures of that strike. One of the highlights was, I think it was one of the counselors with his Westphalia coming around and doing special coffees and eggs Benedict in the morning. And so we hammered out a settlement and in an interest arbitration, got the contracting out language, and joined the framework agreement that others had negotiated, the 8 who had been bargaining in 96. So UNBC was the favored child of Prince George, and the media still is, more or less. But here's Premier Clark with candidate Paul Ramsey, Chuck Fraser, and Lois Boone kicking off the 1996 election campaign. The NDP won, and so they were in power for another 5 years. And with a friendly government in power, pushing employers to come to a table, we established a common agreement in 1998. And so there's some highlights of that. We had building in the 1990s. The portables were removed, and proper admissions and library were established on the front end of the college. A daycare was opened, a dental wing. Dental program was started in the late 80s and flourished in the 90s. Here are some of the activists. Gordon Ingalls, I've already mentioned, Jan Seo, The picture in the middle has John Waters, who was a faculty association president here, taught English before moving down to Douglas and Kwantlen, where he was faculty association at both of those before becoming SIA president in the mid-80s. Here's Ed Laval, who became SIA president in the late 80s and again in the late 90s. And Ben Malcolm was the faculty association president here on the right in the early 80s. Kathy Conroy got involved through a Status of Women committee in the mid-80s, and she became the chief steward at FACNC and then local president, and then went on to become president of SIA from 92 to 95. Ramsey was involved in the CFF in the early mid-70s. He came to CNC in 1975 to teach English. Went to a CFF meeting and was immediately chosen as treasurer of the provincial organization. He took some time off in the early 80s, but came back to be local president, and then had 2 years as president of the SIA from 87 to 89. Kathy again 92 to 95, and I got on the SIA executive in the early 2000s. And was secretary treasurer and president from 2009 to 2018. Ever since 1986, the faculty association, in the strike of 86, the faculty association has maintained an off-campus office. The one at the top is used to be Farmer Tom's Cedar, so the shop was down in the basement. The office in the second floor. It's a long, narrow office. I remember the first meetings I went to were up there. We moved out of that about 2 blocks away, I guess, in a couple of portables that had been used as by an arts company. They had a bunch of kilns in there, so it was wired to the hilt, but the back end of the building was falling off by the time we got it. We were there for about 9 or 10 years before moving into a concrete building that's attached to the post office. Weights and measures were in the back, so they'd always be clunking around bringing stuff in and out of the garage that's just behind us. But it has a nice boardroom, and it's been a good place for us for almost 20 years now. Here's a picture of some of the activists in the 90s. Bill Deutsch, of course, the current president. Jan Masteo, the current chief steward, longtime chief steward. And here's a few pictures of local delegates who went to SIA conventions over the years. Whistler and Nanaimo. Here's some pictures from the 2003 AGM. So just after the Liberals got elected in 2001 and started cutting red tape, hammering budgets, increasing tuition, all that kind of stuff, we met here. Of course, by now, SIA is a member of the BC Fed and the CLC. And Cindy Oliver, the president of SIA, married to Ken Giorgetti, so he was a stalwart at most of our AGMs. But we started to have action plans to talk about where we're going to fight the Liberals, and here are some of the workshops that we had on community activism. The local was part of the Active Voice Coalition that opposed all of the government cuts. I remember being on a stage with QP, UNBC folks, BCGEU folks. We lost 2,000 jobs in Prince George in the space of a couple of years in the early 2000s. And of course, the college was hard hit as well. Both support staff and faculty lost dozens of members and many, many programs. We had invited Minister Bond, a local MLA and deputy premier, to the AGM. She refused to come, so delegates marched from the Civic Center where we were holding the meetings to her office a couple blocks away. And this was the second time I was elected to the provincial executive. I'd been a member at large the year before. Bargaining, second common tabled in 2001. And then I was the co-chair of the Provincial Bargaining Committee in the 2004 and 2007 rounds. These were not difficult. These were difficult rounds of bargaining when we were faced with Liberals who didn't want to give us much until the Olympics were coming along, and they wanted to give us a cash bonus of $4,000 in lieu of putting money on scale. At our peak, FACNC had about 500 members on the rolls when we were doing strike votes in the mid-90s. The number dropped 369 in 2008. That's about 130 less than we had before. Tough years. And of course, the last decade hasn't been much better. So, some new activists and old activists. Jan's there. Deb Collette was the faculty president for a year. David Rourke did it for a couple of years. Marta Tejero has been on every committee that we've had. And Bill Doach has been president for the last 5 years. The local was involved in the provincial Open the Doors campaign. This is the event that was held in March of 2017 to highlight the cuts to programs, but also huge increases to tuition. And so we gave away prizes to students as part of that provincial campaign. We have been ably supported over the years by SIA and FPSC staff reps. Donna Abram, I don't have a picture of her, but she was on the first bargaining committee I was on in 1992. Linda Sperling was heavily involved with us in the late 90s and early 2000s. Barb Brown, after Linda retired, though Barb sadly died too young. David Piasta was our staff rep for many years until he retired, and Zoe Toll has ably replaced him and still advises us almost daily. And Leo McGrady, what can I say about Leo? He started working for the Faculty Association in the late 80s when he was a young lawyer. In the late 70s. I have invoices for like $117 from him in 1979, but he was involved in all of the arbitrations in the 80s. There weren't too many in the 90s other than the interest arbitration, but more in the 2000s. And even though he just retired about a year ago, he's still involved in some of the cases that he was involved with. So here's some highlights of those arbitrations. And interestingly, in BCIT's push to bring satellite courses to the rest of British Columbia, the Faculty Association here thought it would designed to take away jobs from local people. So they launched a grievance against the college, and BCIT wanted to intervene in it. So there's a big arbitration about whether a non-party to a collective agreement could actually intervene. It was determined that they could because they did have an interest in the program running. But interestingly, the Faculty Association and the BCIT Staff Society entered into agreement that said that what they did wouldn't hurt each other. So then there was the layoffs in the early 80s, the arbitration, the Hope Award about extending certification to part-timers, the interest arbitration in the strike, long arbitration over the introduction of the Northern Collaborative Baccalaureate Nursing Program. We went from 20 nursing instructors down to 6. But we actually had 2.5 years because the diploma program was 2.5 years of the program that laddered into UNBC. So it was good for faculty and good for students that they actually taught the first half of third year up at UNBC as a transition to the degree program. And here's some other arbitrations. One's over layoffs, one's over regularization, one's over intercession, and video cameras in classrooms are some of the highlights of many of the arbitrations we have had. And finally, here's a list of faculty association presidents. So often just 1 year at the beginning. Some silly person did it for 5 years in the 90s and then came back for another 3 years and then was chief steward for a while and a bargainer for 3 years and then came back as president again and ended up at FPSE. And we've been ably supported by half-time office admin staff. So Don Stewart and Allison was a sub in the office at the time. Dawn ended up teaching office admin at the college after she left us and is now retired. Jeannie Perdue was here for many years before moving over to Alberta and raising her kids and horses there. And Judy Coyne has been with us for 11 years now. What is CNC going to look like 50 years from now? Who knows? Will it still exist? Will it all be virtual? Everything online? Course creators and markers? This year during the pandemic, the college had 9 or 10 people working to support faculty putting their material online. One of whom, one part-timer, was living in Halifax. We still have a pretty big administration. When I started back in the early 90s, there were about 35 excluded staff, and now there's close to 70. I've been advocating for a worker-run cooperative for a long time. I don't think we're going to get there. And the big question for me is, will we ever get rid of secondary scales? They came in several years before I arrived, and most of my career I've been trying to get rid of them. We have a letter of agreement now that provides some money, about $400,000 over the 3 years to move people from the part-time scale to the common scale, but there's still a long way to go. And what about our student population? What about our domestic students? Demand is ever higher, but the focus seems to be on international. Will they need institutions, or will they be able to get post-secondary from their smartphones or their smart pillows? And what's the world going to be like in 50 years? Again, who knows? But it's going to be interesting, just as the last 50 years has been interesting. And as I am set to retire at the end of August this year, I'll be watching with interest what happens to CNC post-secondary in British Columbia, but also in Canada and the rest of the world. So stay tuned. And thanks for listening to this history of the Faculty Association of the College of New Caledonia.